time of Jesus' death and resurrection, there were approximately 120 followers who continued to gather and assemble as Christians. Now, this is a relatively small number, because if you remember from the Gospels, there were large crowds that followed Jesus. Multitudes went after him. As he taught, as he healed, people seemed to clamor to be close to him. In fact, we remember that there was a crowd of 5,000 people that Jesus fed on a single occasion. And so at the time of Jesus' fairly dramatic end on earth, there was a small group of about 120 folks. Now, if we fast forward to today, there's 2.3 billion Christians, give or take, who profess faith in Jesus. How did that come about? How did a group of 120 grow to be a third of the entire world population on every continent, including probably Antarctica? There's probably a few down there. How did that happen? Well, to get an answer to that, we have to look at the very beginning. And the early account of the beginning of this church is found in the book of Acts. Acts is a book that follows the Gospels and is itself a history, telling the story of the leaders of the early church in the 20 and 30 years following Jesus' resurrection. This includes two primary people. The first is Peter. Peter was, if you remember, the first disciple and apostle. He was called the Rock, kind of like the Rock today, I guess. He was the person on whom Jesus was going to build his church, and he continued to be a primary leader of this early Christian church, especially in Jerusalem. The other person who was of central importance at this beginning time was a guy named Paul. Now, Paul, who is going to be the focus of the lesson today, is important not only for his founding of many early churches, but also in the letters that he wrote to them, which have continued down to us today, and which continue to be a source of inspiration and guidance for Christians in every generation. So the focus of this lesson today is on this second church builder and the author of much of the New Testament, the Apostle Paul. Now, to answer the question of who Paul is, we have to look ourselves to the Scriptures. We get some biographical information in the book of Acts, which accounts for the majority of his church work and his adult life. And we also gather glimpses of biographical information revealed by him in the letters that he's left behind. We know that Paul is a Jewish man, as were all the apostles, and as was Jesus himself. He was a devout practitioner, and his family was of the sect of Judaism known as the Pharisees, which we read about in the Gospels. He was a zealous student, and even went to Jerusalem to study with a leading teacher named Gamaliel at the time. And altogether, we get a sense of a person who's passionate, zealous, deeply intelligent, and has a profound faith. We know as well that Paul wasn't especially prominent in his stature. He was, unassuming in his appearance. But at the same time, the power of his writing and the acuity of his intelligence made him an exceptional teacher and guide for the early church. And his courage and faithfulness were extraordinary models for early Christians as well as for Christians today. What did Paul do? Well, he was a tent maker by trade. Back in the day, people lived in buildings, of course, just like we do. And but people also used tents a fair bit more frequently. Not just for fishing or for camping, but if people were traveling, they would bring with them tents, tents to stay in. And this is what Paul did. He was a tent builder. And interestingly enough, he was also himself an avid traveler. And much of his adult life was spent traveling across the ancient Mediterranean world, sharing his faith in Christ and instructing people in the way that Jesus taught. So this is the little bit that we know about Paul and who he was. His story begins for us in the book of Acts chapter 9. Here we find Paul actually as a persecutor of the ancient church. He is so committed to the traditions that have been handed down to him that he, as did other Jewish leaders at the time, strongly opposed these followers of Jesus and went about rounding them up and putting them into prison. He got authority to go to a neighboring city called Damascus, which was in Syria, to likewise do the same, find Christians and bring them back for trial. But on the road to Damascus, as he's riding along, he suddenly sees a bright light which knocks him off his horse, or knocks him to the ground. And he hears a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And he says, "Who is this?" in his blindness at this bright light. And says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Now go to Damascus where you will find out what I have planned for you to do," essentially. He's brought to Damascus where for 3 days he continues in his blindness and fasts and prays, after which time a messenger comes and reveals to him that he is to be a messenger of Jesus to the wider world. That is not only to the Jewish peoples, but to what are called the Gentiles, people outside of the Jewish community, and to make Jesus known to them. Paul does that, and he is so deeply impacted by this experience, as well as for the love and the grace shown to him through Jesus, that he goes on a number of journeys, missionary journeys, across the ancient world, bringing this good news to them. Now, Paul takes between 3 and 5, we're not exactly sure, long journeys. And they bring him to ancient countries of Turkey, Greece, Macedonia, even up into Italy, and many of the large islands in the Mediterranean. And everywhere he goes into public places, marketplaces, and also into synagogues, and teaches about Jesus being raised from the dead and inviting people to embrace him and be baptized. And here he forms churches. He also, as we know, wrote a lot of letters, just like we might write a letter to our grandparents, or writing a letter of thanks to someone who's given us a gift or helped us out. Paul wrote letters, and through this correspondence, he continued to edify and encourage these churches that he had helped to plant. Now, these letters that Paul wrote were meant to address congregations, gatherings of Christians, and addressed questions that they were having at that particular time. For instance, the letter to the Romans is not written to all people of the city of Rome, but were written to the Christian community at Rome. Just like the letter to the Galatians is to the Christian community in Galatia, and so forth. Now, 9 of these letters have come down to us, and they're letters that Paul wrote to churches to encourage and answer questions that they were having. An additional 4 letters that we have were written to individuals, either kind of a young protege, a colleague of his, a person who he was asking a favor from. These were people that he was, again, writing letters just like you and I might write letters to someone else. And through these, we gain not only a picture of who Paul is, but also central questions that were facing the early Christian church, and his answering of them continues to give us guidance and answers questions that we have about, say, who Christ is and what God has done through him. The one good example of this, which we're going to read in our lesson this week, is 1 Thessalonians. This book was written to the Christians at Thessalonica, which is a city in ancient Greece. And we're going to read this one because it's a good model letter. And we get from it a sense of how Paul wrote and the effect that his letters were meant to have on the early churches. For instance, this letter is encouraging. He himself is writing to uplift people, to remind them of the goodness of God, to share with them the love of Christ for them, and to encourage them to remain steadfast in their efforts to be good people and to follow the way that Jesus taught them to go on. He also, as mentioned, answers questions. In 1 Thessalonians, as well as in 2 Thessalonians, it seems as though they had some questions about when Jesus was going to come again, and what happened to people after they die, and what's going to happen to people in this interim as we're waiting for Jesus to come, as he said he would. Now, Paul addresses this question in part in 1 Thessalonians and more in 2 Thessalonians. And so a part of his correspondence is answering these theological conundrums that people are having at the time. And a last thing that Paul does is to give ethical instruction, to teach people how they are to live and comport their lives now that they have been made new in Jesus. And so this is a nice example of a letter. We're going to read it in its full to gain a sense of how Paul wrote. Now I have to say, and this is somewhat important, that as we talked about early in this course, the Bible can be hard to understand. And Paul's letters are probably the most challenging material in the Bible. I think there could be a good case made for that. He's complex. He is subtle. And even Peter, the other guy we talked about, the other leader of the church, even Peter acknowledges in his letter in the Bible that Paul writes many things that are difficult to understand. Even to him, who's familiar with all the concepts and the circumstances, everything that's going on, even to them, it was kind of hard to follow exactly what Paul was saying. That's because understanding God sometimes is very complicated and is not always self-evident. And I encourage you to read it, maybe even a couple times. And you don't have to understand every word, but doing so helps you get a sense of what Paul's letters were about and what he was attempting to communicate. So give it a good shot this week. In this lesson, we learned about Paul. We learned about a little bit about his life, who he was. We learned about his importance in helping to establish and grow these early Christian communities. And most especially, we learned about his letters, the correspondence which encouraged these early churches and continue to encourage the Church Universal today. Now, it must be said that his life was not easy as he went about this. Paul faced many challenges as he went, from people who opposed his message to natural obstacles he faced and disasters, all the way to opposition from the authorities. Yet nonetheless, the transformative effect that Christ had on him was so profound that he couldn't not do it. Just as we learned, we can perhaps compare him to the prophets, who were not always welcomed by the people who they had messages to bring. But nonetheless, they were so drawn and committed and impelled by their sense of God in their lives that they just had to. We sense the very same here in Paul. And because of his efforts, and as a result of his steadfastness, the church universally not only was planted, but grew and grew and grew and grew by leaps and bounds through time to the worldwide following of Jesus that it is today. So, this is an introduction to Paul and his life, and next week we're going to give our attention to his letters in more detail, reading excerpts from his longer letters all the way down to some of his shorter ones, and getting a sense of the theological points that he is indeed making here in the letters recorded in the New Testament. So blessings on you in your readings this week. I hope you find Paul and his life of interest and also of encouragement yourself. And join us again next week as we delve more deeply into these letters of Paul.